Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala في سورة الشمس يقول قد أفلح من زكاها وقد خاب من دساها كذبت ثمود بطغواها. Translated, roughly we get the interpretation that indeed he who is successful, and here it includes male and female, is that person who purifies it or has been purified. And there's a reference to the soul here, and the soul is being referred to in the feminine form. Zakah, ha. Right, so ha here, the pronoun ha, is indicating to the soul. Right, to the nafs. And then the opposite follows. قَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. And the person that fails to purify it is he that what? Contaminates the soul, corrupts it. When we look at Tafsir al-Baghawi, Imam al-Baghawi rahimahullah, he abridged Imam al-Tha'labi's tafsir. And Imam al-Baghawi rahmatullahi alayh, ensured that the narrations and the transmissions that are found in the tafsir are solid. Imam al-Shawkani rahmatullahi alayhi said that Tafsir al-Baghawi tafsirun la yahtaju ila tahqiq. That's the opinion of Imam al-Shawkani. That is a tafsir which is reliable. It doesn't need much verification. When we look at Tafsir al-Baghawi, and remember that we're looking at actually 3 ayat. We only covered 2 so far. Before going into Tafsir al-Baghawi, let's read the last translation of the ayah. كَذَّبَتْ ثَمُودُ بِطَغْوَاهَا. That the people of Thamud, right, they lied by way of their wrongdoing. By way of their wrongdoing. And their lying here is actually their rejection of prophecy or prophethood. And their prophet was Salih alayhi salam. And they're characterized as a people that were arrogant, who oppressed the poor and denied them their rights. They denied them their basic rights, right? Such as what? Access to natural resources which were needed for them to be able to develop themselves. In this case, the rights of watering and pasture for their cattle. Right. So their livelihood was blocked. Right. So Imam al-Baghawi rahimahullah, he says here that in this point Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala is swearing قَدْ أَفْلَهَا. So Allah is swearing in this case, right, that the person that's successful, what? The person that reaches success and reaches a sense of contentment with the self is the one that purifies the self, or that's been purified by Allah. Allah has corrected it, right? The self, and purified it from sins and guided it so that it is consistent and congruent with what? Acts of obedience. وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. Here another what? Point of emphasis is made. That indeed the person is unsuccessful and has fallen into a state of loss and what? And misguidance, right? That Allah at this point is misguiding the person because of what? The corruption that's brought to the self, right? That corruption then revolves around what? The self engaging in activities which are self-destructive spiritually. Destructive of the soul. Destructive of the soul. So here when we say the sehe is as though it's saying that the dignity and the nobility of the soul, right, is disregarded by actions what? Which plunge one into loss. And what? And corrupt one. And take away from one's standing. And because one chooses that path, then the outcome is what? Traversing a path of destruction. So once that activity begins to take place in which the self is what? Corrupted. The nobility of the soul is what? Disregarded. Then the self what? Becomes a self lost. Right? Self lost. And the truth is here that what the person is doing by corrupting it is what? Is covering up the reality and identity of the soul. And that's a state of kufr. It's a state of kufr. And a state of sin, right? So it's going, the ayat that we're reading are going from talking about the individual, then moving to talking about the people of Thamud. The people of Thamud. So Thamud as a community is given the model of being that society which fell into loss and destruction. And what? In kufr, because they negated prophethood. Because what? They engaged in sins without what? Turning back towards the guidance that's brought from Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. The reflection that we want to bring to the table here is that there's a necessity for us to look at ourselves and to look at the necessity of self-changing, right? Two necessities. First, we need to look at ourselves. Then the second is that we need to look at ourselves changing, right? These things are imperative. Imperative. In a society in which the individual is the focus, what has become the case is that we're looking to see what? How religion can accommodate to us. Rather than seeing how we can be people transformed. People transformed. So that's the difficulty that we encounter. Ourselves. The second difficulty that we encounter is a culture that some of us have, which is one of sin, indulging in sin. And this in itself brings its own destruction in effect. And so freedom in this case has to be what? That of responsibility. Right? Freedom for responsibility. Freedom coupled with responsibility. Choice coupled with responsibility. And that responsibility in the first ranking is responsibility for the self. The soul is noble. The soul is noble. And Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala tells us in Surah Al-Baqarah that the human being has a particular status which is unique. And contemporary philosophy and varying ideologies undermine the role of the human being's uniqueness. And this reality of the uniqueness of the human being is something which is shared in common by the people of the book and the people of Islam. Contemporary science, because of its insights into physics and its insights into other dimensions through various perceptions, through various techniques, has displaced the role of the human being. And that's an assumption. Actually, the uniqueness of the human being becomes more prominent when we realize how grand the universe is. That the universe is something which the human being is contemplating and realizing how grand it is, right? And then the possibility of life seems to be something that is so unique. The possibility in particular of human life. Given that the human being, in comparison to other forms of life, is so weak, but at the same time so unique, the same time so destructive, potentially productive. And Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala indicated to that reality, Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa, that indeed I am establishing on the earth a vicegerent. And in this sense, then, the role and the identity of the human being becomes manifest. So the reality then of our role in relation to ourselves is one in which we are stewards of the soul. The life of the human being comes between two slots of time, beginning and end, as far as the material existence is considered. The human being has a birth and a death, and the Quran illustrates 2 births and 2 deaths. But here we're talking about what? A birth and a death. We come into the world and then we go out of the world. And our material existence is cut short, and then other realities manifest. In that duration of time, there's an indication that the challenge that we face is to be stewards of the soul. The one who's successful is the one who has the ability to safeguard the precious trust, which is to what? To ensure that our relationship with Allah, that the soul remains in the shade of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala by following His commands. And that's where our relationship to prophethood becomes very important. Because it is by way of the prophets that we come to be guided, and in particular by way of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين.